Okay, stop whatever you are doing right now because what I'm about to tell you is going to fundamentally rewire how you think about human civilization, and I am not exaggerating even slightly. Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that nobody on Earth can read. Not a single person. Every book is gibberish. Every sign is decoration. Every screen displays meaningless shapes. Your children will never learn to write their names. Your grandchildren won't even know that reading was ever possible. They will look at a printed page the way you look at bird tracks in the mud. Just random marks with no meaning whatsoever. That sounds like the plot of a dystopian movie, right? Something that could never actually happen in the real world. Well, here's the thing that nobody ever told you in school. It already happened. It happened to one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth, and it didn't last for a decade or a generation. It lasted for roughly 3,000 years of silence, so complete that when humanity finally started writing again, the people holding the pen had absolutely zero memory that their own ancestors had ever known how to do the same thing. Now, before you assume this is about some obscure tribe in a remote corner of the world, let me correct that assumption immediately, because this happened in the cradle of Western civilization itself. This happened in the lands that would eventually produce democracy, philosophy, mathematics, theatre, and nearly every foundational idea the modern world is built upon. The very people we celebrate as the architects of rational thought, the ancient Greeks, they are the ones who forgot. They forgot so completely and so thoroughly that when they encountered the massive stone ruins their own great-great-great-grandparents had built, they genuinely believed that giants must have constructed them, because surely no human being could have accomplished such a feat. They were staring at the achievements of their own bloodline and had no idea. But here is what is really going to cook your brain. The forgetting wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part is what caused it, because the civilizations that went silent didn't collapse because they were weak or primitive or unsophisticated. They collapsed because they were too advanced. The very things that made them powerful, their interconnected trade networks, their specialized economies, their complex bureaucracies, those exact strengths became the mechanisms of their annihilation. And when I explain how that worked, you are going to start seeing some very uncomfortable parallels with the world you and I are living in right now. That is not hyperbole. Actual historians who study this period have started publishing papers drawing explicit connections between the Bronze Age collapse and modern global vulnerabilities. But we will get to that. First, I need to show you what was destroyed, because unless you understand the sheer magnificence of what existed before the silence, you cannot possibly grasp how terrifying the silence really was. Picture the Mediterranean world around 1250 BCE. I need you to really visualize this because most people have a completely wrong image in their heads. When you hear ancient civilization, you probably imagine mud huts and people in loincloths banging rocks together. Erase that image entirely. What actually existed was a network of interconnected superpower kingdoms stretching from Greece to Egypt to Turkey to Syria to Lebanon, all of them trading with each other. All of them communicating through written diplomatic correspondence, all of them building structures so impressive that some of them are still standing today more than 3,000 years later. This wasn't the beginning of civilization. This was civilization at what might have been its first true peak. The Mycenaeans in Greece built palace complexes that covered entire hilltops. These weren't crude stone forts. These were architectural masterpieces with multiple stories, interior courtyards, sophisticated drainage systems, walls decorated with vibrant painted frescoes showing everything from religious processions to hunting scenes to women in elaborate dress. The fortification walls surrounding these palaces were constructed from limestone blocks so massive that individual stones weigh several tons. Modern engineers have studied these walls and confirmed that moving and placing stones of this size required not just enormous labor forces but genuine engineering knowledge, understanding of leverage, counterweights, ramp construction, and structural load distribution. And they could write. This is the critical detail. The Mycenaeans possessed a writing system called Linear B, a syllabic script where each symbol represented a syllable rather than a single letter. Their scribes were trained professionals, educated in palace schools, employed by the state to maintain the economic records that kept the entire system functioning. And those records reveal a society of staggering complexity. We have Linear B tablets listing hundreds of female workers organized by their specific occupations. We have inventories of bronze vessels numbering in the thousands. We have records tracking sheep flocks containing tens of thousands of animals with notations about wool production quotas. We have land ownership documents so detailed and so legalistic that modern scholars need specialized knowledge just to interpret the bureaucratic terminology. This was not a primitive society playing at civilization. This was a mature, sophisticated, bureaucratically complex world that had been developing and refining its systems for centuries. And everything I just described was only the Greek portion of a much larger picture. Now here is something that is going to shift your perspective entirely. What I want you to understand is that the Mycenaeans were not operating in isolation. They were one node in an international network so interconnected that a disruption in Afghanistan could affect pottery production in Greece. I am not making that up. Let me explain how. Bronze, the metal that gives the entire age its name, is an alloy of copper and tin. Copper was relatively available from sources in Cyprus and other Mediterranean locations, but tin was extraordinarily rare. The primary sources of tin in the ancient world were located in what is now Afghanistan, with possible additional sources in Central Asia and perhaps Cornwall in England. Getting tin from Afghanistan to a bronze smith in Mycenae required a trade route stretching thousands of miles, passing through multiple kingdoms involving dozens of intermediary traders, crossing both sea and land, maintained by an intricate web of diplomatic relationships and trade agreements. In 1982, a shipwreck was discovered off the coast of Turkey at a place called Uluburun. This single vessel, dating to approximately 1300 BCE, contained cargo from at least 11 different cultures, 10 tons of copper from Cyprus, 1 ton of tin probably from Afghanistan, ivory from elephants that roamed Egypt or Syria, ebony wood from tropical Africa transported through Egypt, glass beads from Mesopotamia, amber from the Baltic Sea, thousands of miles to the north, pomegranates from the Levant, pistachios from somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, pottery from Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus and the Levantine coast. One ship, a Levantine coast. One ship, 11 cultures worth of goods. This wasn't unusual. This was just a Tuesday in late Bronze Age international trade. The Hittite Empire based in Anatolia, modern Turkey, was so powerful it went toe-to-toe with Egypt and fought them to a standstill. The Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE between Hittite and Egyptian forces was one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history, involving thousands of vehicles on each side. The war ended not with victory for either side, but with one of the earliest recorded peace treaties in human history. We have copies from both sides. The Hittites kept theirs in cuneiform on clay tablets at their capital, Hattusa. The Egyptians carved their version on temple walls. Both versions survive. Both can be read. This was international diplomacy at a level that wouldn't be matched again for centuries after the collapse. At the city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, archaeologists have found texts written in 8 different languages using 5 different scripts. Let that sink in for a moment. A single city where educated people routinely operated in 8 languages and could write using 5 completely different writing systems. This wasn't a great imperial capital. This was a trading port. The level of multilingual literacy among its educated class exceeds what you would find in most modern cities. Egypt under Ramses II was at the absolute height of its new kingdom power. This was the pharaoh who built Abu Simbel, who expanded the temple complex at Karnak, who constructed more monuments than any other ruler in Egyptian history. Egyptian trade networks reach from the Mediterranean to what is probably modern Somalia. Egyptian writing in hieroglyphic, hieratic and demotic forms recorded everything from royal propaganda to love poetry, from surgical procedures to magical incantations, from detailed tax records to personal letters between ordinary people complaining about their neighbors. This is the world I need you to hold in your mind, a world of interconnected civilizations spanning thousands of miles, a world of literacy and learning, a world of international law and diplomacy, a world of specialized craftsmanship and monumental architecture. A world that had taken centuries to build and that seemed as permanent and enduring as the stone palaces that housed its rulers. And I need you to hold that image very firmly because now I'm going to tell you what happened to it. But actually, before I do that, I need to tell you about something else first. Because there is a detail about how Linear B was rediscovered that is so ironic, it almost feels like the universe has a dark sense of humor. Nobody knew Linear B existed until archaeologists started excavating Bronze Age sites in the late 1800s and early 1900s. When they found the tablets covered in mysterious symbols, nobody could read them. The script sat undeciphered for decades, one of the great puzzle boxes of ancient studies. Scholars argued about what language it might represent. Some thought it was an early form of Phoenician. Others suggested it might be Etruscan or some unknown Anatolian language. Hardly anyone seriously proposed that it might be Greek, because the prevailing assumption was that the Greeks hadn't possessed writing before adopting the Phoenician alphabet around 800 BCE. Then in 1952, a man named Michael Ventris changed everything. Ventris wasn't even a professional linguist. He was an architect, but he had been obsessed with Linear B since he was 14 years old when he attended a lecture by the famous archaeologist Arthur Evans. Working essentially alone using techniques he developed himself, including a kind of early statistical analysis of symbol frequency and distribution, Ventris cracked the code, and what he found sent shock waves through the entire academic establishment. Linear B was Greek, ancient Greek. The Mycenaeans had been writing in an early form of the same language Homer would later use to compose the Iliad and the Odyssey. But here is where the irony becomes almost unbearable. When Homer composed those epics around 750 BCE, he was completely illiterate. The Iliad and the Odyssey are oral compositions, memorized and performed by singers who could not read or write a single word. Homer had no idea that his own ancestors had possessed writing. He didn't know that beneath the ruins he could see on the Greek landscape lay thousands of clay tablets covered in a script that recorded the language he was speaking. He composed the greatest works of ancient Greek literature without any awareness that literature in the written sense had once been common in his own land. Between the last Linear B tablet and Homer's first epic, roughly 400 years passed. 4 centuries during which the entire concept of writing was erased from Greek cultural memory. And here is what makes this even more heartbreaking. The Linear B tablets that survive weren't preserved on purpose. They were temporary records, economic notes scratched into unfired clay meant to be erased and recycled when the information was no longer needed. The only reason we can read them today is because the palaces that housed them burned down. The fires of destruction baked the clay, accidentally preserving records that were never intended to last. The catastrophe that killed Mycenaean civilization is the same catastrophe that preserved our only proof it had ever been literate. If this is making you rethink everything you thought you knew about how secure human knowledge really is, then we are on the same page. And if you are the kind of person who finds this as fascinating and frankly as unsettling as I do, then you are exactly who this channel is for. That little subscribe button isn't just a button right now, it's a decision about whether stories like this keep being told or disappear into the algorithm like Linear B disappeared into the earth. Your call. So now we arrive at the question that has haunted historians for over a century. What destroyed this world? What force was powerful enough to simultaneously bring down every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, to burn palaces across 3 continents, to erase literacy from entire regions, to crash populations by as much as 90% in some areas? What happened around 1200 BCE that turned the lights off across the ancient world? The traditional answer, the one you'll find in older textbooks, is 4 words. It was the Sea Peoples. Ancient Egyptian texts, particularly from the reign of Pharaoh Ramses III, describe waves of foreign invaders arriving by ship and by land. Groups with strange names like the Pelizet, the Chika, the Shiklish, the Danayan, and the Sherdan. These texts claim the Sea Peoples destroyed the Hittite Empire, laid waste to Cyprus, burned the cities of the Levantine coast, and were only stopped when the mighty Egyptian military defeated them in a series of desperate battles around 1178 BCE. For decades, scholars accepted this narrative almost without question. The Sea Peoples were cast as Bronze Age barbarians, faceless raiders from unknown lands who swept through the civilized world like a swarm of locusts. They were blamed for everything. Every burned palace, every destroyed city, every abandoned settlement, all of it was attributed to these mysterious invaders. Mystery solved. Case closed. And it was such a clean, satisfying explanation that nobody looked too closely at it for a very long time. But then people started looking closely, and what they found was that the Sea People's explanation has more holes in it than a fishing net. First problem: who were the Sea Peoples? We do not actually know. The names given in Egyptian texts are Egyptian renderings of foreign names, filtered through Egyptian phonology and hieroglyphic writing. They are essentially meaningless labels that we cannot definitively connect to any known population. Some scholars have suggested the Peliset might be the Philistines who later appear in the Bible. Maybe. Or maybe not. The identifications are speculative at best. Second problem: the timeline does not work. The Egyptian accounts of the Sea Peoples date to around 1178 BCE, but some of the destructions they are supposedly responsible for happened decades earlier, around 1200 to 1110 BCE. Other destructions happened later. When you carefully date the destruction layers at archaeological sites across the Mediterranean, you find that the catastrophes didn't happen simultaneously. They unfolded over a period of 50 to 70 years, maybe longer. This doesn't match a single coordinated invasion. It looks more like a rolling collapse, a cascade of failures spreading like dominoes across the region. Third problem: not all destruction sites show evidence of military attack. At Pylos, one of the great Mycenaean palaces, the archaeological evidence shows the palace burned, but there are no massed arrowheads, no siege works, no mass graves of defenders. The Linear B tablets found in the destruction layer actually include records of the palace organizing coastal defenses and deploying troops to watch points along the shore. They saw something coming. They prepared for it. But there is no evidence that battle was ever joined at the palace itself. Some scholars think the inhabitants might have abandoned and deliberately burned their own palace. Why would anyone do that? What were they running from if it wasn't an army at the gates? Fourth problem, and this is the really big one. The Sea People's explanation doesn't account for what happened in Greece at all. The Egyptian texts focus entirely on the eastern Mediterranean, the Hittite lands, Cyprus, the Levantine coast. They never mention Greece, but the Mycenaean palaces were destroyed too, and they were destroyed first or at least simultaneously with the eastern sites. If the Sea Peoples swept west to east, as some reconstructions suggest, then what destroyed Greece before they even got there? So the clean story falls apart. The Sea Peoples weren't the answer. Or at least, they weren't the whole answer. They might have been part of the picture, but the picture itself is far more complex and far more disturbing than a simple invasion narrative. Because what actually destroyed the Bronze Age world appears to have been something much harder to fight than an army. You can build walls against invaders, you can train soldiers, you can forge weapons and rally defenders. But what do you do when the enemy isn't a who but a what? What do you do when the enemy is everything going wrong at the same time? Modern scholars studying the late Bronze Age collapse have increasingly turned to a concept from systems theory called cascading failure. This is what happens when multiple interconnected systems start breaking down simultaneously, with each failure triggering and amplifying others in a chain reaction that becomes impossible to stop. Think of it like a row of dominoes, but instead of neat sequential toppling, imagine every domino hitting 3 others and each of those hitting 3 more. The failures don't add up. They multiply. Start with climate. Paleoclimatic evidence drawn from pollen cores, seabed sediments, tree ring data, and stalagmite growth patterns tells us that the eastern Mediterranean experienced severe drought conditions beginning around 1200 BCE and lasting for decades, possibly over a century. This wasn't a single bad year. This was a generational shift in climate that would have devastated agriculture across the entire region. Now think about what drought means in an agricultural society. Crops fail. Livestock die. Food stores run low, then run out. People get hungry. Hungry people get desperate. Desperate people make dangerous decisions. They hoard resources. They fight over water. They turn on their neighbors. They abandon their homes and move looking for better conditions, creating waves of refugees that put pressure on wherever they go. But the Bronze Age Mediterranean had survived droughts before. Climate stress alone probably couldn't have brought down the entire system. What made this drought so devastating was the context in which it hit. Remember the interconnected, globalized world I described earlier? Remember the trade networks stretching thousands of miles, the palace economies dependent on imported materials, the specialized labor forces that didn't grow their own food? That interconnection, which made everyone richer in good times, became a death sentence when things went bad. Here is how the cascade might have worked, and pay close attention because this is where the parallels with our modern world become impossible to ignore. Drought hits the eastern Mediterranean. Grain harvests fail across multiple regions simultaneously. Egypt, which had previously exported grain to needier areas, suddenly can't spare any because it needs everything for its own population. Hittite records from this period actually contain desperate letters requesting emergency grain shipments. The Hittite king writes to the pharaoh essentially begging for food. Without imported grain, smaller kingdoms and city-states face famine. Social unrest follows. People lose faith in rulers who can't feed them. Political instability creates power vacuums. Opportunistic raiders exploit the chaos. Trade routes become unsafe as desperate people turn to piracy or banditry. Without safe trade routes, tin stops arriving from Afghanistan. Without tin, bronze production grinds to a halt. Without bronze, you can't make the tools and weapons your society depends on. Your economy, literally named after this metal, can no longer produce it. Each failure feeds back into the system, making everything worse. Famine weakens military capacity. Weakened militaries can't protect trade routes. Disrupted trade routes reduce resource availability. Reduced resources intensify famine. Intensified famine drives migration. Migration creates conflict. Conflict disrupts agriculture further. The spiral accelerates and at some point crosses a threshold where recovery becomes impossible. The system doesn't decline, it shatters. Now add earthquakes to this picture, because as if drought and famine and trade collapse and political instability weren't enough, the geological evidence suggests that the eastern Mediterranean experienced significant seismic activity during this same period. The region sits at the junction of several tectonic plates, making it one of the most earthquake-prone areas on the planet. Evidence consistent with earthquake damage has been found at multiple sites, including Mycenae and Tiryns, where walls collapsed outward and massive stones were displaced in patterns that don't match military destruction. A major earthquake in a Bronze Age palace economy would have been catastrophic. These palaces were the economic, administrative, and religious hearts of their territories. Destroying the palace meant destroying the central warehouse, the record-keeping center, the redistribution hub, the seat of authority. It meant destroying the grain stores the population depended on. It meant destroying the workshops where specialists produced valuable goods. Everything flowed through the palace. Kill the palace and you kill the entire system it supported. Now imagine drought and earthquake hitting the same region within a few years of each other. The palace has been damaged by an earthquake. Grain stores are compromised. Agricultural production is already reduced by drought. The palace bureaucracy is disrupted. Maybe some of the scribes are dead. Maybe the records are destroyed. Maybe the physical infrastructure for collecting and redistributing resources is damaged beyond quick repair. The surrounding population, which has been paying tribute and receiving services in return, no longer sees the benefit of supporting a damaged institution that can't help them. Loyalty evaporates. People start looking out for themselves. This is where the Sea Peoples fit into the picture, not as the cause of the collapse, but as a consequence of it. The Sea Peoples were probably mixtures of refugees displaced by famine and collapse in their own homelands, mercenaries hired by one failing state to fight another, and opportunistic raiders exploiting the chaos. They weren't barbarians emerging from nowhere to destroy civilization. They were civilized people whose own civilizations had already failed. Cast adrift in a world falling apart around them. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramses III, who fought the Sea Peoples, left extensive records of these encounters carved on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. His inscriptions described foreign countries being consumed by crisis. He talks about a conspiracy of foreign lands, about kingdoms being destroyed in their own territories, about peoples moving en masse searching for a place to settle. Reading between the lines of Egyptian propaganda, what you see is not a coordinated military invasion, but a chaos of displaced peoples, a vast human crisis driven by the systemic failure of the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. Egypt survived. Barely. The effort of repelling or absorbing the sea people seems to have exhausted Egypt's resources. Within a century of Ramses III, the new kingdom entered a terminal decline. The great pharaonic civilization would continue in diminished form for centuries, but would never again reach the heights of the new kingdom. Even Egypt, the most resilient of the Bronze Age civilizations, was permanently wounded by the collapse. But here is the detail that haunts me more than anything else about this entire catastrophe. In all the destructions across all the sites, across all the regions, there is one loss that outweighs all the others combined. More than the palaces, more than the trade networks, more than the population decline. The thing that was lost and that would take the longest to recover was writing itself, because writing in the late Bronze Age was not what writing is today. It was not a widely distributed skill that anyone could pick up. It was a specialized professional activity performed by trained scribes working within institutional contexts. The scribes were palace employees. The schools that trained them were palace operations. The economic records they produced served palace purposes. Writing existed because palaces existed. When the palaces burned, the entire ecosystem that supported literacy burned with them. Within a single generation, maybe less, the ability to read and write vanished from Greece. Not because anyone outlawed it, not because some tyrant burned the books, not because of a deliberate campaign against knowledge. It vanished because the institutions that supported it ceased to exist, and without institutional support, a specialized skill that serves no purpose in a subsistence farming village simply dies of irrelevance. The last scribe to write in Linear B probably didn't know he was the last. He was probably just doing his job, recording whatever needed recording, worried about the crisis unfolding around him, but not imagining that his entire professional tradition was about to go extinct. Maybe he survived the palace's destruction. Maybe he fled to some small village and tried to make a living as a farmer. And when he died years or decades later, taking his literacy with him, nobody noticed because nobody needed what he could do anymore. The skill simply ceased to exist. Silently, completely, permanently. And the silence that followed lasted not for years or decades, but for roughly 400 years. 4 centuries during which not a single person in Greece could read or write a single word. 4 centuries during which all knowledge had to be preserved in human memory or lost forever. 4 centuries during which history became myth and myth became legend, and the actual past of an entire civilization dissolved into stories about gods and monsters and heroes who might or might not have ever existed. What happened during those 400 years of darkness is something I have not told you about yet. And honestly, it is one of the most fascinating and disturbing chapters in all of human history, because the people who lived through the Dark Ages weren't just surviving, they were transforming. They were becoming something entirely different from what their ancestors had been. And the civilization that would eventually emerge from the darkness, the civilization of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Alexander, that civilization was shaped not by the glories of the Bronze Age, but by the horror of having lost everything and having to rebuild from absolute zero. But before I get into that, I need to tell you about one specific archaeological discovery that perfectly encapsulates the tragedy of the collapse in a single heartbreaking image. And once you hear about it, you will never think about the fragility of civilization the same way again. At the Palace of Pylos in the southwestern Peloponnese, archaeologists found a collection of Linear B tablets in the destruction layer, the layer of burned debris marking the palace's final day. These tablets were the last documents produced by the palace scribes, and they tell a story that reads like a thriller. The tablets describe a kingdom in crisis. Military forces are being reorganized and deployed to coastal watch stations. Bronze is being collected from temples, literally stripped from religious artifacts and melted down, a sign of extreme desperation because you do not desecrate sacred objects unless you have exhausted every other option. Rowers are being conscripted for ships. Resources are being redistributed in emergency patterns that don't match normal administrative practice. The scribes at Pylos could see disaster coming. They were preparing for it. They were documenting their preparations with the meticulous bureaucratic precision that had characterized their work for generations. And then the palace burned, and the scribes disappeared, and the tablets they had written in their final hours lay buried under rubble for over 3,000 years. until archaeologists brushed away the dirt and read the last words of a dying civilization. Those tablets are among the most haunting documents in all of human history. They are a civilization's final to-do list written by people who did not know they were writing their own epitaph. And every time I think about that unknown scribe carefully recording bronze allocations and troop deployments, while his entire world was falling apart around him, I am reminded that the people who live through civilizational collapse don't experience it the way we study it. They don't see the big picture. They don't know they're living through a historical turning point. They're just trying to get through the day. They're just doing their jobs. They're just hoping that if they follow the procedures and maintain the systems, everything will somehow work out. It didn't work out. Not for them. Not for anyone in the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. The palaces burned. The cities fell. The trade networks collapsed. Writing disappeared. And humanity entered a darkness so complete that we are still working to understand it more than 3,000 years later. If you are still watching right now, and I suspect you are because this story has a way of grabbing people by the collar and refusing to let go, then you're about to hear something that almost nobody outside of academic circles knows about. What actually happened during the Dark Ages themselves, the day-to-day reality of life after civilization collapsed, contains details so strange and so counterintuitive that they challenge everything we think we know about human resilience and the nature of progress itself. And buried within those dark centuries is a secret about how the Greeks eventually recovered that is going to completely change how you think about what makes civilizations succeed or fail. That part of the story is coming next, and trust me, it is worth waiting for because what happened in the darkness is in some ways more extraordinary than what happened in the light. The world after the collapse looked nothing like the world before it, and I mean nothing. If you could somehow transport a Mycenaean palace official from 1250 BCE forward in time just 150 years to 1100 BCE and drop him in the Greek landscape, he would not recognize his own homeland. The palaces that had dominated hilltops for centuries were blackened ruins, slowly being swallowed by vegetation. The roads that had connected major centers were overgrown and impassable. The harbors that had once welcomed ships from Egypt and Syria and Cyprus were empty. The villages that had surrounded the palaces, feeding them with tribute and receiving services in return, had either vanished entirely or shrunk to clusters of houses so small you could count the inhabitants on your fingers. Population statistics for this period are genuinely shocking, and I want you to understand that when scholars estimate population decline, they are being conservative because the archaeological evidence suggests the reality might be even worse than the numbers imply. In the Argolid, the region around Mycenae itself, the number of identifiable settlements drops by roughly 90% between the end of the Bronze Age and the depths of the Dark Ages. 90%. In Messenia, the region around Pylos, the decline is even more dramatic. Areas that had supported dozens of thriving communities were reduced to near emptiness. In Boeotia, in Laconia, in the islands, the pattern repeats with only minor variations. People didn't just die, they vanished. Where did they go? This is a question that genuinely puzzles researchers because the death toll from the initial destructions, while certainly significant, probably wasn't enough to account for such dramatic population decline. Some people died in the violence of the collapse, obviously. Some died in the famines that followed when the palace distribution systems that had fed specialized workers ceased to function. Some probably died from diseases that swept through weakened, malnourished populations. But many must have simply left, migrated, walked away from their homeland and gone somewhere else. Where? We have tantalizing clues but no definitive answers. Some Greeks appear to have migrated to Cyprus, where Greek-speaking communities established themselves during and after the collapse. Others may have moved to the coast of Anatolia, establishing the communities that would later be known as the Ionian Greeks. Some might have gone further, joining the very migrations of peoples that the Egyptians recorded as the Sea Peoples. It is entirely possible that some of the Sea Peoples' Egyptian forces fought were actually displaced Mycenaean Greeks, former palace subjects turned refugees, turned raiders by the collapse of their own world. Think about that for a moment. The same civilization that built the palaces might have produced the raiders that helped destroy other people's palaces. Victim and perpetrator might have been the same population at different points in the cascade of collapse. This is how systemic failures work. They don't create neat categories of winners and losers. They create chaos where everyone loses in different ways at different times. But what about the people who stayed? What about the Greeks who didn't migrate, who remained in the homeland and tried to build lives in the wreckage of their ancestors' world? Their experience is where this story becomes most human and most strange, because what archaeology reveals about Dark Age life contradicts almost every assumption you might have about what happens after a civilization falls. The first thing that changed was where people lived. During the Mycenaean period, settlements were concentrated in open lowland areas near good agricultural land, with palaces situated on prominent hilltops overlooking their territories. These locations made sense for a confident civilization that controlled its surroundings and needed easy access to farmland and trade routes. After the collapse, the settlement pattern flipped almost entirely. People abandoned the lowlands and the prominent positions. Instead, they moved to hidden defensible locations, hilltops tucked away in mountain valleys, sites accessible only through narrow passes that could be easily watched and defended. This tells us something crucial about the psychology of the survivors. These were not people expanding into new territories or choosing optimal locations for farming. These were people hiding. They chose locations where enemies would have difficulty finding them and where a small group could defend against a larger attacking force. They chose escape routes over agricultural productivity, safety over prosperity, invisibility over prominence. Whatever had destroyed the palaces, the survivors were still afraid of it. Or perhaps they were afraid of each other, afraid of the chaos that filled the vacuum left by collapsed authority. The houses they built in these defensive locations were simple almost to the point of being crude. One room, sometimes two, built with rough stone foundations and mud brick walls, topped with thatched roofs. No painted frescoes, no sophisticated drainage, no specialized rooms for different functions. Just basic shelter. A family lived in a space not much larger than a modern bedroom, shared with their possessions and sometimes their animals during cold weather. The contrast with the palatial complexes of a century earlier could not be more stark. And here is something that most people find deeply counterintuitive about this period. The Dark Age Greeks didn't just lose writing and monumental architecture and international trade. They lost technologies that seemed far more basic and far more essential. Pottery production declined dramatically. Mycenaean pottery had been thrown on fast wheels, fired at carefully controlled high temperatures, and decorated with elaborate painted scenes showing marine life, chariots, warriors, religious processions. It was produced in specialized workshops by trained craftspeople and was good enough to be traded across the entire Mediterranean. Dark Age pottery is almost unrecognizable by comparison. The decoration shrinks to simple geometric patterns, lines, triangles, concentric circles. The quality of firing becomes inconsistent. The forms become simpler. Figurative decoration, images of people and animals and objects, almost completely disappears for over 2 centuries. This wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a consequence of losing the specialized workshops and the trained potters who had operated them. When everyone is focused on not starving, there is no surplus to support pottery specialists. The former who makes his own pots in his spare time produces functional vessels but not art. Metalworking declined similarly. The sophisticated bronze-working tradition of the Mycenaeans, which had produced weapons and tools and vessels of remarkable quality, degraded rapidly when tin became unavailable. Some regions shifted to iron, but early iron technology was primitive compared to what the Bronze Age had achieved. The first iron tools and weapons were actually inferior to the bronze items they replaced. In terms of metallurgical quality, civilization went backward. Let me say that again because it bears repeating. The technology got worse. Not different, not evolved, worse. Cruder, less effective, less sophisticated. This challenges one of the most deeply held assumptions in modern Western culture. The idea that technology only moves in one direction, forward. We assume that once something is invented, it stays invented. We assume that knowledge, once gained, is permanently secured. The Dark Ages proved this assumption catastrophically wrong. Technologies can be lost. Skills can disappear. The arrow of progress can reverse direction. And when it does, the reversal can last not for years but for centuries. Now here is where things get genuinely weird, and this is the part almost nobody talks about. How did the Dark Age Greeks relate to the ruins of the civilization their ancestors had built? Because those ruins were everywhere, you couldn't walk through the Greek landscape without encountering them. Massive stone walls, collapsed palace complexes, Tholos tombs, those spectacular beehive-shaped burial chambers that the Mycenaeans had built for their elite dead. These structures were visually stunning, architecturally sophisticated, and completely inexplicable to people who had lost all memory of who had built them or why. The response of the Dark Age Greeks to these ruins is one of the most psychologically fascinating aspects of the entire period, and it reveals something profound about how humans process the incomprehensible. They didn't ignore the ruins. They didn't avoid them. Instead, they incorporated them into their belief systems in ways that transformed physical remains into mythological landscapes. At Mycenae, people made offerings at the Bronze Age tombs. They left pottery vessels, small figurines, food and drink. They were treating these tombs as sacred sites, places where powerful beings had been buried, beings worthy of veneration and propitiation. But who did they think was buried there? Not their own ancestors. Not historical kings and queens whose names and deeds had been recorded in Linear B. They thought these were the tombs of heroes, semi-divine beings from a mythological past, when gods walked the earth, and humans were stronger, braver, and more beautiful than anyone alive. The gap between reality and belief here is staggering. These were tombs of actual historical people, Mycenaean elites whose names might have been recorded on tablets lying buried just a few meters away, but the descendants making offerings at those tombs had no access to that information. They had lost writing. They had lost historical records. They had lost the institutional memory that connects present to past. All they had were stories, oral traditions passed down through generations, evolving with each retelling, gradually shedding historical specifics and acquiring mythological elaboration. This is how Agamemnon became a demigod instead of a bureaucrat. This is how the Trojan War became an epic of honor and divine intervention, instead of what it probably actually was, a military campaign driven by economic competition and geopolitical strategy. This is how the complex administrative reality of Mycenaean palace economies was replaced by stories about heroes feasting in golden halls served by faithful retainers. The real past was mundane, bureaucratic, recognizable to anyone who has worked in a modern government office. The remembered past was magical, heroic, populated by beings barely human in their beauty and power. And here is the thing that really gets me. The mythologized version was more useful. In a Dark Age village where survival depended on courage, physical strength, and personal loyalty, stories about bureaucratic procedures and wool production quotas weren't relevant. But stories about heroes who faced impossible odds with bravery and cunning? Stories about warriors whose honor meant more to them than their lives? Stories about clever tricksters who outsmarted stronger opponents? Those stories taught values that actually mattered in a harsh, dangerous world. The oral tradition didn't preserve history because history wasn't what people needed. People needed inspiration. They needed models of behavior. They needed stories that made sense of a frightening, unpredictable world. The Homeric epics that would eventually be composed from these oral traditions are the supreme expression of this process. The Iliad and the Odyssey are not history. They're mythology built from fragments of historical memory, shaped by centuries of oral transmission, reflecting the values and concerns of Dark Age society rather than the realities of the Bronze Age world they claim to describe. When Achilles rages at Agamemnon in the opening of the Iliad, the conflict is about honor and respect, about a warrior's right to the prizes he has earned through personal valor. This makes sense in a Dark Age context where status was determined by individual prowess. It makes much less sense in the context of a Mycenaean palace economy where the king's authority derived from institutional position and bureaucratic control. Homer's world is a Dark Age world wearing Bronze Age costumes. And nobody knew this until modern archaeology revealed the actual Bronze Age. For over 2,000 years, from Homer's time until the excavations of Schliemann and Evans and Bleegen, everyone assumed the Homeric epics were more or less historical. The Trojan War had happened. Agamemnon had ruled Mycenae. Odysseus had sailed the seas. The details might be embellished, but the basic story was true. Only when archaeologists uncovered the real Mycenaean world with its linear B tablets and its palace bureaucracies did scholars realize how fundamentally different the historical reality was from the mythological tradition. And this revelation raises a question that should bother you deeply. If the Greeks could be so completely wrong about their own past despite having oral traditions stretching back to the events in question, what else might we be wrong about? What other historical traditions that we accept as basically accurate might turn out to be mythologized beyond recognition? What do we think we know about the past that is actually as fictional as Homer's version of the Trojan War? I don't have answers to those questions, and anyone who claims to is lying. But the questions themselves are important because they remind us that knowledge is fragile, memory is unreliable, and the stories we tell ourselves about our past may have only the loosest connection to what actually happened. Now let me tell you about something that happened during the Dark Ages that researchers didn't expect to find, because it doesn't fit the narrative of uniform darkness and despair. Remember how I said the Dark Ages weren't uniformly dark everywhere? There are anomalies, sites and regions that seem to defy the general pattern of collapse and regression. And the most spectacular of these anomalies is a place called Lefkande. Lefkande is a site on the island of Euboea, a large island off the east coast of mainland Greece. In the 1980s, archaeologists excavating there discovered something that shouldn't have existed. Buried under a mound of earth, they found the remains of a massive building dating to approximately 1000 BCE, right in the middle of the darkest part of the Dark Ages. This building was about 50 meters long and 10 meters wide, an enormous structure by any standard but especially extraordinary for a period when most buildings were tiny one-room houses. The building wasn't just big, it was architecturally sophisticated with an apsidal plan, meaning one end was curved rather than squared off. It had a central row of wooden posts supporting the roof. It was clearly a significant structure requiring considerable labor and resources to construct. And inside it, archaeologists found something even more remarkable. In a shaft cut into the floor of the building, they found two burials. One was a woman adorned with gold jewelry, including a spectacular gold pendant and gold rings. Beside her was a bronze vessel imported from Cyprus, proof that some level of international trade was still occurring even at this dark period. The other burial was a man, or rather the cremated remains of a man, placed inside a bronze amphora that was itself an antique, a vessel manufactured during the Mycenaean period, over a century before it was used as a funerary urn. Next to the human burials were the skeletons of 4 horses, buried with iron bits still in their mouths. Gold jewelry, imported bronze from Cyprus, an antique Mycenaean vessel preserved as an heirloom, horse burials with iron equipment. This is not what poverty looks like. This is wealth, status, connections to the wider world, all things that supposedly didn't exist during the Dark Ages. And then the community did something even more remarkable. Shortly after the burials were placed inside, the entire building was deliberately demolished and buried under a massive earthen mound. The community invested enormous labor in destroying and entombing a building they had invested enormous labor in constructing. Why? What was the purpose of building something magnificent, only to immediately bury it? Scholars have debated this for decades, and there is still no consensus. Some think it was a heroic burial, a great chief commemorated with a building constructed specifically as a funeral monument. Others think it was a functioning building, perhaps a chief's hall, that was converted into a tomb when its owner died. Some have proposed religious explanations involving cults of the dead or ancestor worship practices we don't fully understand. Whatever the explanation, Lefkande proves that the Dark Ages were more complex than simple narratives of uniform collapse would suggest. Some communities maintained significant wealth and organization even during the darkest period. Some trade connections survived. Some artistic traditions continued. The darkness was not absolute everywhere. But Lefkande also raises a troubling question. If some communities could maintain this level of sophistication during the Dark Ages, why didn't they spark a general recovery? Why did it take centuries more for Greek civilization to rebuild? The answer might be that Lefkande-type communities were isolated pockets of relative prosperity in an ocean of poverty and disorder. Without the broader network of interconnected civilizations that had characterized the Bronze Age, Even the most successful individual communities couldn't achieve systemic recovery. One wealthy village does not make a civilization. You need networks, trade routes, institutional structures, shared culture, literacy. Individual success stories couldn't substitute for systemic recovery, and systemic recovery required conditions that didn't exist yet. This insight has implications that extend far beyond ancient history. And if you are thinking about what it means for our own interconnected world, I want to hear those thoughts in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of conversation that needs to happen more often. We talk endlessly about individual resilience, personal preparedness, self-sufficiency, and those things matter. But the lesson of the Dark Ages is that individual survival isn't enough. Civilization is a collective achievement. It depends on networks and systems that no individual or even no single community can maintain alone. When those networks fail, even the strongest individuals are reduced to a fraction of what they could achieve within a functioning system. The scribe at Pylos was probably personally brilliant. His training represented years of intellectual investment. His skills were genuinely impressive. But alone, without the palace, without the bureaucracy, without the economic system that gave his work meaning and purpose, his brilliance was useless. He couldn't be a scribe in a world that didn't need scribes. His knowledge died with him because there was no system to transmit it to the next generation. Now I want to tell you about something that happened during the later Dark Ages that would eventually change everything, something so subtle that the people living through it almost certainly didn't realize its significance. Around the 9th century BCE, roughly 300 years after the collapse, something began to shift. It was gradual, almost imperceptible, visible only in the archaeological record when you compare conditions across decades rather than years. But it was real, and it was important. Population started growing. Not dramatically, not explosively, just slowly, incrementally, one more child surviving here, one more family establishing a new farmstead there. Villages that had contained 20 people contained 30. Areas that had been abandoned saw a trickle of resettlement. The raw demographic foundation of civilization was rebuilding itself one birth at a time. With slightly more people came slightly more specialization. Instead of every family making everything it needed, some individuals began focusing on particular crafts. A potter who made better pots than his neighbors could trade his surplus for food, freeing him to spend more time refining his technique. A metalworker with access to iron ore could produce tools and weapons that others would pay for. Specialization is the engine of economic development, and it was slowly, fitfully, unevenly beginning to restart. Trade networks began reforming almost organically. A village near the coast might trade with fishermen. Fishermen might encounter traders from other islands. Traders from other islands might bring goods from even further afield. Step by step, connection by connection, the web of exchange that had collapsed so catastrophically in 1200 BCE began to reassemble itself, not in the same form, not through palace bureaucracies managing international commerce, but through individual traders and small communities reaching out, making contacts, exchanging goods. And then something happened that nobody could have predicted, something that had never happened before in the history of the Greek world, something that would set the stage for the most creative explosion in ancient history. But what that something was, and how it transformed an impoverished backwater into the birthplace of Western civilization, requires me to tell you about a group of people living on the other side of the Mediterranean, whose own survival of the Bronze Age collapse would end up changing everything for the Greeks in ways neither culture could have imagined. The people I'm about to tell you about are arguably the most underrated civilization in all of human history, and the fact that most people have never even heard of them is one of the greatest injustices in how we teach the past. Because without them you would not be reading these words right now. Without them the Greek alphabet would not exist. Without them the Latin alphabet would not exist. Without them the English alphabet you use every single day of your life would not exist. Every text message you have ever sent, every book you have ever read, every sign you have ever followed, every document you have ever signed, all of it traces back to a group of traders and sailors living on a narrow strip of coastline in what is now Lebanon, who did something so revolutionary that it changed the trajectory of human civilization permanently. They are the Phoenicians, and their story is inseparable from the story of how Greece climbed out of the darkness. But here is what makes the Phoenicians truly extraordinary, and what most accounts completely fail to mention. They shouldn't have survived the Bronze Age collapse at all. Their cities, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, set right in the middle of the destruction zone. Ugarit, a major city just up the coast from them, was so thoroughly annihilated that it was never reoccupied and lay buried under sand for over 3,000 years. The Hittite Empire to the north was obliterated. Kingdoms to the south were devastated. The sea peoples swept through the very waters the Phoenicians depended on for their livelihood. By every logical calculation, the Phoenician cities should have been destroyed along with everything else. But they weren't. They survived. And not just barely survived. They emerged from the collapse in a position of strength, stepping into the vacuum left by the destruction of the great Bronze Age powers and establishing themselves as the dominant maritime traders of the early first millennium BCE. How did they pull this off? What was different about the Phoenicians that allowed them to weather a catastrophe that destroyed civilizations far larger and seemingly far more powerful than theirs? The answer to that question contains one of the most important lessons about civilizational resilience that you'll ever encounter, and it is a lesson that applies directly to our modern world in ways that should make every policymaker and every business leader and honestly every ordinary citizen sit up and pay serious attention. The Phoenician cities were organized differently from the great palace economies that collapsed. The Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the kingdoms of the Levantine interior, they were all centralized, top-down hierarchical systems where one institution, the palace, controlled nearly everything. The palace managed trade. The palace employed the scribes. The palace redistributed agricultural surplus. The palace commissioned art and craft production. Everything flowed through a single central node, and when that node failed, the entire system crashed. The Phoenician cities, by contrast, were more distributed, more flexible, more bottom-up in their organization. Yes, they had kings and elites. Yes, there were hierarchies of wealth and power, but their economies weren't as completely dependent on a single central institution. Trade was conducted by independent merchants and merchant families, not solely by palace bureaucrats. Wealth was distributed across multiple power centers, not concentrated in a single palace complex. The cities themselves were relatively small and densely packed, easier to defend and easier to maintain than sprawling palace territories. This distributed structure meant that when the crisis hit, the Phoenician cities could absorb damage without experiencing total systemic failure. If one trade route was disrupted, there were alternative routes. If one merchant family was wiped out, others survived. If one aspect of the economy collapsed, other aspects continued functioning. The system was resilient because it wasn't dependent on any single point of failure. And here is where the parallel to our modern world becomes sharp enough to cut. Think about the difference between a centralized system where everything depends on one critical infrastructure and a distributed system with multiple redundancies. Think about what happens when a single supply chain fails in our globalized economy versus what would happen if we had multiple diverse supply chains for critical goods. Think about the difference between storing all your data in one cloud service versus maintaining multiple backups in different formats and different locations. The Phoenicians survived because they were diversified. The palace economies collapsed because they were concentrated. That is a lesson worth learning. But the Phoenicians didn't just survive. They innovated. And their greatest innovation was something that seems so simple in retrospect that you might wonder why nobody had thought of it before. Except that somebody had thought of it before, or rather, it had evolved through a process of gradual simplification over centuries. I'm talking about the alphabet. Now, this requires some background, because the history of the alphabet is one of the most convoluted and contested topics in all of ancient studies, and I'm going to simplify it considerably, but the essential story goes like this. Writing in the ancient Near East started with complex systems. Sumerian cuneiform used hundreds of signs. Egyptian hieroglyphics used hundreds of signs. Linear B used roughly 90 signs. These systems worked, but they were cumbersome and difficult to learn, which meant that literacy was always restricted to a small class of professionally trained scribes. Over time, in the Levantine region, the area where the Phoenicians lived, scribes began experimenting with simpler writing systems. The process is still debated, but at some point, probably in the second millennium BCE, somebody had a revolutionary idea. Instead of using symbols to represent whole words or syllables, what if you used symbols to represent individual consonant sounds? Since any spoken language uses only a limited number of distinct consonant sounds, you would only need a couple dozen symbols to write anything you could say. This was the birth of the alphabet, or more precisely, the birth of the consonantal alphabet, because this early system only recorded consonants, not vowels. The Phoenician version of this alphabet, which emerged in its mature form around 1050 BCE, used 22 symbols, each representing a single consonant sound. 22 symbols. That is it. Compare that to the hundreds of signs required for cuneiform or hieroglyphics, or the 90-odd signs of Linear B. 22 symbols that could be learned in days rather than years. This simplicity was transformative. For the first time in human history, literacy was potentially accessible to anyone, not just professionally trained scribes employed by palace bureaucracies. A merchant could learn to write well enough to keep his own records. A sailor could scratch a message on a potsherd. An ordinary person could leave an inscription without needing years of specialized education. Writing was democratized, liberated from the institutional context that had always controlled it. The Phoenicians carried their alphabet everywhere their ships sailed, and their ships sailed everywhere. As the dominant maritime traders of the post-collapse Mediterranean, the Phoenicians established trading posts and colonies across the entire sea from modern-day Lebanon to Spain, Carthage in North Africa, Cadiz in Spain, settlements in Sicily, Sardinia, Malta, Cyprus. Wherever there was trade to be done and profit to be made, the Phoenicians were there, and wherever they went they brought their alphabet. Greek traders encountered the Phoenician alphabet probably sometime in the 9th century BCE, though the exact date is debated. Some scholars place the adoption as early as 900 BCE, others as late as 775 BCE. The earliest known Greek alphabetic inscriptions date to around 775 to 755 BCE. But the alphabet might have been in use for a generation or more before anyone happened to write on a surface that survived to the present day. Now here comes the critical innovation, the modification the Greeks made that transformed the Phoenician consonantal alphabet into something even more powerful. The Phoenician alphabet only recorded consonants. If you wrote the equivalent of the English word bat, you would write just bat, and the reader would have to figure out the vowel from context. This works reasonably well for Semitic languages like Phoenician, where consonant roots carry most of the meaning and vowel patterns are relatively predictable. It works terribly for Greek, where vowels carry crucial grammatical information, and where different vowels can completely change a word's meaning. The Greeks solved this problem with an act of creative misunderstanding that ranks as one of the most consequential accidents in intellectual history. The Phoenician alphabet included symbols for consonant sounds that didn't exist in Greek, sounds like the glottal stop and certain guttural consonants that Semitic languages use but Greek does not. Greek speakers learning the Phoenician alphabet encountered these symbols and essentially said, "What sound is this supposed to represent? I don't make that sound. It sounds like a vowel to me." And they repurposed these consonant symbols as vowel symbols. The letter alpha comes from the Phoenician aleph, which represented a glottal stop. The Greeks turned it into the vowel a. The letter epsilon comes from he, another consonant the Greeks didn't need. They turned it into the vowel e, and so on. Through this process of creative adaptation, the Greeks produced the first true alphabet, a writing system where every sound in the language, both consonants and vowels, was represented by its own symbol. This might seem like a minor technical detail, but its consequences were enormous. A true alphabet with vowels represented can capture spoken language with much greater precision than a consonantal alphabet. You don't have to guess which vowel the writer intended. Every word is spelled out completely, unambiguously, accessibly. This made Greek writing even easier to learn and use than Phoenician writing. It lowered the barrier to literacy even further. And here is the cruel, beautiful irony that sits at the heart of this entire story. The Greeks who adopted the Phoenician alphabet and transformed it into the first true alphabet had no idea that their own ancestors had once possessed writing. They thought they were learning something entirely new, a foreign technology imported from the East. They had no memory of Linear B, no knowledge that Mycenaean scribes had once kept detailed records in Greek. The 400 years of darkness had erased that memory so completely that the Greeks experienced the return of literacy as a first encounter rather than a homecoming. Imagine that. Imagine your civilization once had writing and lost it so thoroughly that when writing comes back centuries later, your people treat it as a brand new invention they are encountering for the first time. That is the depth of the forgetting. That is how complete the break was. The thread of cultural memory had been so thoroughly severed that one of the most fundamental technologies in human history had to be reintroduced from outside as if it had never existed before. But the return of writing did something that I don't think anybody anticipated. It didn't just allow people to keep records and write letters. It captured and preserved the oral traditions that had sustained cultural memory through the Dark Ages. And the first and greatest beneficiary of this preservation was the tradition we know as Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey had been composed and transmitted orally for generations. Singers called Aeodoi, bards, had memorized thousands of lines of poetry and performed them at gatherings and festivals. These weren't fixed texts that were recited word for word like actors performing a script. They were living traditions, stories with a known overall shape and sequence of events, but with enormous flexibility in the specific wording. Each performance was unique, shaped by the singer's skill, the audience's reactions, the context of the occasion. These oral poets had developed sophisticated techniques to help them compose and remember their songs. They used formulaic phrases, ready-made expressions that fit the rhythm of the poetic meter and could be slotted in wherever needed. Wine-dark sea, rosy-fingered dawn, swift-footed Achilles, cunning Odysseus. These phrases aren't just poetic decoration, they are memory aids, building blocks that allowed the singer to construct verses in real time without having to compose every single word from scratch. They also used type scenes, standardized descriptions of recurring events like arming for battle, preparing a feast, launching a ship, receiving a guest. These type scenes followed predictable patterns that the singer knew by heart and could deploy whenever the story required that particular kind of event. If a hero needs to put on armor, the singer has a template for the arming scene that he can customize with specific details about this particular hero and this particular set of armor. These techniques, formulaic phrases, and type scenes are the fingerprints of oral composition. When scholars in the 20th century, particularly Milman Parry and his student Albert Lord, recognized these patterns in Homer, they revolutionized our understanding of the epics. The Iliad and the Odyssey weren't the products of a literate author sitting at a desk composing written poetry. They were the products of an oral tradition stretching back centuries, preserved in the memories and performances of professional singers who couldn't read or write. But at some point, probably in the late 8th century BCE, these oral epics were written down. Whether Homer himself was literate and composed with the aid of writing, or whether he composed orally and someone else transcribed his words, or whether the transition from oral to written happened over multiple generations with different portions being written at different times, these are questions scholars still argue about. What is clear is that writing captured these traditions and fixed them in a form that could survive independently of any individual singer's memory. And when that happened, something was both gained and lost. What was gained was permanence. The Iliad and the Odyssey would survive for nearly 3,000 years and counting, transmitted through manuscripts and eventually printed books to audiences around the world. What was lost was the living flexibility of the oral tradition. Once the epics were written down, they became texts, fixed words on a page that could be copied but not changed, studied but not improvised upon. The tradition stopped evolving and became a monument. But the new technology of alphabetic writing didn't just preserve old traditions, it enabled entirely new forms of thought and expression that had never been possible before. And this is where the story takes its most dramatic turn, because what happened in Greece after the return of writing represents one of the most explosive creative revolutions in all of human history. In the space of just 2 or 3 centuries, a culture that had been illiterate and impoverished produced philosophy, democracy, scientific inquiry, dramatic theatre, historical writing, and art of a quality and sophistication that still defines Western civilization today. How? How does a culture go from total darkness to producing Socrates and Plato and Aristotle in just a few hundred years? How does a society that couldn't write a grocery list in 900 BCE produce the Parthenon and the tragedies of Sophocles by 450 BCE? What happened in those intervening centuries that transformed the backward, impoverished communities of the Dark Ages into the most culturally creative civilization the ancient world had ever seen? The answer, and this is going to surprise you, is that the Dark Ages themselves might have been responsible. Not despite the collapse, but because of it. The devastation that destroyed Mycenaean civilization didn't just wipe the slate clean in a negative sense. It created conditions that made certain kinds of innovation possible, conditions that might never have existed if the old order had survived. Think about it this way. The Mycenaean palace economies were rigid, hierarchical, centrally controlled systems. Power was concentrated, social roles were fixed. Innovation was not rewarded because the system was designed to perpetuate itself, not to change. If you were born a farmer, you died a farmer. If you were born a scribe, you died a scribe. The palace decided what was produced, how it was distributed, and who got what. It was stable, orderly, and profoundly conservative. The Dark Ages shattered all of that. With the palaces gone, there were no more rigid hierarchies, no more centralized control, no more fixed social roles. People had to improvise. They had to solve problems their ancestors had solved for them. They had to develop new forms of social organization because the old forms had been destroyed. This forced improvisation, this necessity of invention, created a culture that valued flexibility, adaptability, and individual initiative in ways that the palace economies never had and never would have. When the polis emerged, the Greek city-state, it was something genuinely new, not a palace economy, not a centralized kingdom, a community of citizens who governed themselves through shared laws and collective decision-making. This political form had no precedent in the Bronze Age. It could not have emerged from the Mycenaean system, which was structured to prevent exactly this kind of distributed political participation. It could only have emerged in the post-collapse world where the old structures were gone and new ones had to be invented. Similarly, Greek philosophy, that tradition of asking fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, ethics, and existence, might not have been possible within a palace system that maintained ideological control through state religion and royal propaganda. The Dark Ages broke the monopoly of the old religious and political authorities. When new forms of thinking emerged in the archaic period, they did so in a cultural environment where questioning was possible because the institutions that would have suppressed questioning no longer existed. If this idea is blowing your mind as much as it blew mine when I first encountered it, then you understand why this story matters so much. Because the implication is staggering. The greatest cultural achievements of ancient Greece, the very foundations of Western civilization, democracy and philosophy and scientific reasoning and dramatic art, these things didn't emerge despite the Dark Ages. They emerged because of them. The collapse destroyed an old order and in doing so created the conditions for something entirely new and in many ways entirely better. Now I need to be very careful here, because I am absolutely not saying that collapse is good or that we should welcome catastrophe, because it might lead to innovation. The people who lived through the Bronze Age collapse and the Dark Ages suffered enormously. Millions died. Knowledge was lost. Generations lived in poverty and fear. No amount of subsequent cultural achievement justifies that suffering or makes it worthwhile in any moral calculus. What I am saying is that human history is not a simple story of progress or decline. It is a complex story of cycles, of collapses and recoveries, of losses and innovations, of endings that contain the seeds of new beginnings. The Dark Ages destroyed one world and in doing so made possible another world that its predecessors could never have imagined. That is not a justification for destruction. It is an observation about the complex, unpredictable nature of historical change, and it raises a question that I find both terrifying and thrilling. If our own civilization were to experience a significant collapse, not necessarily the total devastation of the Bronze Age, but a serious systemic disruption, what might emerge from the other side? What forms of social organization, what mode of thought, what cultural achievements might become possible in a post-collapse world that are not possible within our current system? What potential futures are being foreclosed by the very success and stability of our present civilization? I don't pretend to know the answers, but I think the questions are worth asking. And the fact that we can ask them, The fact that we can study the Greek Dark Ages and draw lessons from them, that itself is a triumph of the literate tradition that was so nearly lost 3,000 years ago. We can learn from the past because the past was eventually recorded, but only barely, only because writing came back, only because the chain of transmission was eventually reconnected. If that thought doesn't make you want to ensure this story reaches as many people as possible, then I don't know what will. Every single person who watches this video and really absorbs what it means becomes a node in the network of cultural memory, someone who carries this knowledge and can transmit it further. When you share this video or talk about what you learned here with someone else, you are doing exactly what the Dark Age Greeks couldn't do. You are preserving and transmitting knowledge. You are strengthening the chain. So if there was ever a video worth sharing, this might be it. Not because I made it, but because the story itself demands to be remembered. Let me now turn to one of the most remarkable and underappreciated aspects of the Greek recovery, something that demonstrates human resilience in a way that I find genuinely moving. Because the Greeks didn't just recover their own civilization, they planted the seeds of civilization across the entire Mediterranean world. And the way they did it was unlike anything that had come before. Starting in the 8th century BCE, Greek communities began establishing colonies at an extraordinary rate. Within about 200 years, Greek settlements dotted the coastlines of the Mediterranean and Black Seas, from the Strait of Gibraltar to the shores of modern Ukraine, Massalia, modern Marseille in France, Neapolis, modern Naples in Italy, Syracuse in Sicily, Cyrene in Libya, Byzantium, later Constantinople, later Istanbul on the Bosphorus. Dozens more spread across thousands of miles of coastline. These weren't imperial conquests. The Greeks didn't send armies to conquer foreign lands and impose their rule on subject populations. They sent groups of settlers, sometimes just a few hundred people, who established new communities on unoccupied or sparsely occupied coastal sites. These colonies were independent city-states, connected to their mother cities by ties of culture and religion, but governing themselves according to their own laws. Why did they colonize? Multiple reasons. Population growth put pressure on limited agricultural land in Greece. Internal political conflicts drove losing factions to seek new homes elsewhere. Entrepreneurial ambition drew traders and adventurers to new opportunities. But whatever the motivations, the result was a vast expansion of Greek culture across the Mediterranean, creating a network of Greek-speaking communities that would become the medium through which Greek ideas, Greek art, Greek philosophy, and Greek writing spread to other cultures. And the alphabet traveled with the colonists. Everywhere the Greeks went, they brought their writing system. Local peoples who traded with or lived near Greek colonies encountered the alphabet, and many adopted it for their own languages. The Etruscans in Italy adopted a version of the Greek alphabet. The Romans adopted the Etruscan version and modified it further, creating the Latin alphabet. The Latin alphabet spread with the Roman Empire and eventually became the most widely used writing system in the world. The letters you are reading right now, whether in the subtitles of this video or in the comments section below, are direct descendants of the alphabet that the Greeks created by modifying the Phoenician consonantal alphabet in the 8th century BCE, which means they are also the distant heirs of a tradition that was born from catastrophe, from the need to replace a writing system that had been lost, from the creative energy of a culture rebuilding itself after total collapse. Every letter of every word you have ever read is a monument to human resilience. Every sentence is proof that knowledge lost can be regained, that darkness doesn't last forever, that civilizations can rebuild. The very existence of the alphabet you use is evidence that the Dark Ages ended, that writing returned, that the silence was eventually broken. And that brings me to something I haven't mentioned yet, something that connects the ancient world directly to the present moment, in a way that is going to make you see your own life differently. Because there is one more lesson from the Dark Ages that I haven't discussed yet, and it might be the most important one of all. The lesson I'm about to share with you is something that took me years of reading and research to fully understand, and once I did, it changed how I see not just ancient history, but modern life in a way that I genuinely was not prepared for. It has to do with a concept that historians and archaeologists use, but that almost never makes it into popular discussions about the past. The concept is called systemic memory, and it refers to the knowledge that exists not in any individual person's mind, but in the systems and institutions and networks that a civilization builds over time. And understanding systemic memory is the key to understanding why the Dark Ages lasted as long as they did, why recovery was so slow, and why our own civilization might be far more vulnerable than any of us want to admit. Let me explain what I mean with an example that will make this immediately concrete. Think about how bread gets to your table. You probably buy it at a store. The store gets it from a distributor. The distributor gets it from a bakery. The bakery gets flour from a mill. The mill gets grain from a farmer. The farmer uses seeds developed by agricultural scientists, fertilizers produced by chemical companies, machinery manufactured by industrial firms using metals mined on multiple continents, fuel refined from oil extracted thousands of miles away. The farmer's land is irrigated by water systems designed by engineers, maintained by utility workers, funded by tax revenues collected by government agencies. No single person understands this entire system. The farmer doesn't know how to refine oil. The oil refiner doesn't know how to design irrigation systems. The engineer doesn't know how to breed crop varieties. The agricultural scientist doesn't know how to operate a grain mill. And yet bread arrives at your table every single day because the system as a whole contains all of this knowledge distributed across millions of people connected through institutions and networks and supply chains. This is systemic memory. It is the knowledge embedded in the connections between people rather than in any individual person. It is the understanding built into infrastructure, encoded in institutional procedures, expressed through supply chains and trade relationships and professional training programs. It is the accumulated wisdom of centuries of trial and error, innovation and refinement, preserved not in books or databases, but in the living, functioning systems of civilization itself. And here is the terrifying thing about systemic memory. When the system collapses, this knowledge doesn't just become inaccessible, it ceases to exist. You can't write it down because it isn't the kind of knowledge that fits in a book. It is relational, procedural, distributed. It exists only in the functioning of the system itself. Destroy the system and you destroy the knowledge. This is exactly what happened during the Bronze Age collapse. The knowledge of how to run a palace economy, how to manage international trade networks, how to coordinate specialized production across multiple sites, how to maintain diplomatic relationships between kingdoms, all of this was systemic memory. It existed in the connections between scribes and administrators, between traitors and producers, between kings and their bureaucracies. When the palaces burned and the trade networks collapsed and the bureaucracies disbanded, this knowledge simply evaporated. It wasn't preserved in the Linear B tablets because the tablets only recorded outputs of the system, economic transactions and inventories, not the knowledge of how to run the system itself. Think of it this way. If I gave you a printout of every financial transaction that occurred at a major corporation last year, you would have a massive amount of data, but you still wouldn't know how to run that corporation. You wouldn't know the unwritten rules, the informal relationships, the institutional culture, the practical know-how that makes the whole thing function. That kind of knowledge lives in people and in the connections between people. It can't be fully captured in records. The Mycenaean scribes recorded transactions, but they didn't record the knowledge of how their civilization worked, because that knowledge was too complex, too distributed, too embedded in practice to be written down. And so, when the civilization collapsed, that knowledge was lost even though some of the records survived. Future archaeologists could read the tablets, but they couldn't reconstruct the living system that had produced them, at least not fully. This is why recovery took so long. It wasn't just about rebuilding physical infrastructure or repopulating empty lands. It was about recreating systemic memory, developing new knowledge of how to organize complex societies, how to manage trade networks, how to coordinate specialized production. This kind of knowledge can't be taught from a book because it doesn't exist in book form. It has to be developed through practice, through trial and error, through generations of people gradually building up the institutional and relational knowledge that makes complex civilization possible. 400 years. That is how long it took for Greece to develop enough systemic memory to support writing again. 400 years of small communities slowly growing, slowly reconnecting, slowly developing the institutional complexity that could support specialized activities like literacy. 400 years of rebuilding knowledge that had been destroyed in a generation. And here is where this connects to our modern world in a way that should make every single person watching this video deeply uncomfortable. Our civilization's systemic memory is vastly more complex than anything the Bronze Age world possessed. The knowledge embedded in our global systems, our supply chains, our technological infrastructure, our institutional networks is so complex that no human mind or group of human minds could possibly reconstruct it from scratch. If our systems collapsed, the recovery time wouldn't be 400 years, it could be much, much longer because we would have so much more to rebuild. Consider something as seemingly simple as a computer chip. The semiconductor fabrication process involves thousands of steps using equipment that is itself the product of decades of specialized development. The factories that produce chips cost billions of dollars. The supply chains that provide raw materials span the globe. The engineers who design the chips and the technicians who operate the fabrication equipment have training that takes years to acquire. The knowledge of how to make computer chips doesn't exist in any one place. It is distributed across thousands of companies, millions of workers, countless institutional relationships. If that system were disrupted, if the factories were destroyed, if the supply chains were broken, if the trained personnel were dispersed, rebuilding semiconductor fabrication capability from scratch would be extraordinarily difficult even if you had complete blueprints for every piece of equipment and every fabrication step. Because the blueprints don't capture the systemic memory, the tacit knowledge, the learned expertise, the institutional relationships that make the whole thing actually work. This isn't just true for computer chips. It is true for pharmaceuticals, for aviation, for telecommunications, for electrical power generation, for water treatment, for food processing, for virtually every system that modern civilization depends on. The knowledge that makes these systems function is overwhelmingly systemic, embedded in networks of people and institutions rather than recorded in any accessible form. We are in a very real sense more vulnerable to knowledge loss than the Bronze Age civilizations were, because we have more systemic memory to lose and because that memory is more complex and more difficult to reconstruct. The Mycenaeans needed 400 years to rebuild a civilization complex enough to support literacy. How long would it take to rebuild a civilization complex enough to support semiconductor fabrication, or pharmaceutical production, or satellite communication? These are not rhetorical questions. They are genuine uncertainties that we should be thinking about seriously. Now I realize this might sound alarmist, and I want to be clear that I am not predicting imminent civilizational collapse. What I am doing is pointing out a vulnerability that the Greek Dark Ages illuminate with particular clarity. The lesson isn't that collapse is inevitable. The lesson is that systemic memory is fragile, that it can be lost, and that losing it has consequences that last far longer than the initial catastrophe. Being aware of this vulnerability is the first step toward addressing it, and there are things we can do. We can invest in preserving not just data, but knowledge in its broadest sense. The skills and expertise and institutional understanding that make our systems work. We can build redundancy into critical systems so that no single failure can cascade into total collapse. We can maintain diverse approaches to essential technologies rather than converging on a single method that creates a single point of failure. We can strengthen local communities and local capabilities so that if global systems are disrupted, people can still meet basic needs while larger systems are restored. These aren't radical proposals. They are basic risk management. And the fact that we need to learn them from a 3,000-year-old catastrophe says something about how badly we have failed to think seriously about civilizational resilience in the modern world. But let me move away from modern implications for a moment and go back to the ancient world, because there is a chapter of the Dark Ages story that I haven't told you yet, and it involves one of the strangest and most counterintuitive discoveries archaeologists have ever made about this period. It concerns what happened to religion during the Dark Ages and what emerged from that transformation would shape the spiritual imagination of the Western world for millennia. During the Mycenaean period, religion was closely tied to the palace system. We know from the Linear B tablets that the Mycenaeans worshipped many of the same gods who would later appear in classical Greek mythology. The names Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Hermes, Artemis, and Dionysus all appear in Linear B texts, along with several divine names that don't survive into later Greek religion. Religious activity was organized through the palace, with priestesses and priests listed as palace functionaries receiving allocations of goods from the palace stores. Rituals were performed at palace shrines and at sacred sites that the palace maintained. When the palaces collapsed, this institutional framework for religion collapsed with it. The professional priesthoods lost their support. The palace shrines fell into ruin. The organized religious calendar maintained by the palace bureaucracy ceased to function. But religion itself didn't disappear. People kept worshipping, they kept praying, they kept praying, they kept making offerings. They just did it differently. What emerged during the Dark Ages was a more decentralized, community-based form of worship. Instead of palace-managed religion organized around institutional priesthoods, Dark Age communities developed their own local cults, centered on particular sites and particular deities. Some of these sites were old, Bronze Age sacred places that maintained continuity through the collapse. Others were new, places that acquired religious significance during the Dark Ages for reasons we can only guess at. And here is where things get really interesting. Some of the most important religious sites of classical Greece, sites that would become famous throughout the ancient world, seem to have originated or grown significantly during the Dark Ages. Olympia, where the Olympic Games would be held. Delphi, home of the famous oracle. Delos, sacred island of Apollo. These sites began attracting worshippers from increasingly wide areas during the later Dark Ages, serving as meeting places where people from different communities could come together for religious festivals. This is significant because in a world without writing, without political unity, without institutional connections between communities, these religious gatherings served a crucial social function. They were among the only occasions when people from different villages and different regions interacted. They were opportunities for trade, for marriage alliances, for the exchange of information and ideas. They were the nodes around which wider Greek identity began to coalesce. Think about what that means. In the absence of political unity or written communication, religion became the primary medium through which scattered Dark Age communities maintained connections to each other and to a shared cultural identity. The gods were the thread that held the Greek world together when every other thread had snapped. Without the ongoing worship of shared deities at increasingly important regional sanctuaries, the individual communities of the Dark Ages might never have reconnected sufficiently to produce a recognizable Greek civilization. And here is the detail that sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. The Olympic Games, arguably the most famous cultural institution of the ancient Greek world, traditionally dated their founding to 776 BCE. That is right at the end of the Dark Ages, right at the cusp of the recovery. The Games were held at Olympia, a sanctuary of Zeus in the western Peloponnese, and they drew competitors and spectators from across the Greek world. The Olympic Games were more than athletic competitions. They were religious festivals. They were diplomatic events. They were occasions for Greeks who lived in distant, scattered communities to come together and affirm their shared identity. They were proof that despite centuries of darkness, despite the loss of writing, despite population collapse and cultural regression and the forgetting of their own history, the Greeks had maintained enough cultural coherence to recognize each other as members of a common civilization. The Games involved a sacred truce, a period during which all warfare between Greek states was supposed to cease so that athletes and spectators could travel safely to Olympia. This truce was remarkably effective, honored even by states that were bitter enemies. It worked because the Games were sacred, embedded in religious obligations that even the most aggressive warlord was reluctant to violate. And the competitions themselves, the races and wrestling matches and chariot events, were expressions of the heroic values that oral poetry had preserved through the Dark Ages. The athletes competed for glory, for the honor of being recognized as the best, just as Homeric heroes competed for glory on the battlefield. The Games were a ritual reenactment of heroic values, a living expression of the culture that had been maintained through 4 centuries of darkness by the singers of epic poetry. So here you have an extraordinary chain of transmission. Mycenaean palace culture collapses, writing is lost, but oral poetry preserves distorted memories and cultural values. Religious practices maintain shared identity across scattered communities. Regional sanctuaries become meeting places that reconnect isolated populations. Athletic competitions at these sanctuaries express the heroic values preserved in poetry. And from all of this, slowly, a new civilization emerges that is recognizably Greek, despite having lost almost everything that made Mycenaean Greece what it was. The chain almost broke. It came terrifyingly close to breaking completely. If the oral tradition had been lost, if the religious practices had died out, if the regional sanctuaries had never developed, the Greeks might never have recovered their cultural identity. They might have become a scattered collection of isolated farming communities with no connection to each other and no memory of a shared past. Individual communities might have survived, but Greek civilization would not have been reborn. But the chain held, barely, imperfectly, in degraded and transformed form, but it held. And when conditions improved, when population grew, when trade resumed, when writing returned, there was enough cultural foundation to build on. The Dark Ages hadn't destroyed everything. They had destroyed the superstructure, the palaces, the bureaucracies, the writing system, the trade networks, but they hadn't destroyed the substrate, the language, the gods, the stories, the fundamental sense of identity that made people recognize each other as Greek. This distinction between superstructure and substrate is crucial, and I think it applies far beyond the ancient world. Every civilization has both. The superstructure consists of the visible institutions, the governments, the economies, the technologies, the infrastructure. The substrate consists of the deeper cultural foundations, the language, the values, the stories, the sense of shared identity. The superstructure can be destroyed relatively quickly. The substrate is more resilient because it lives in people rather than in institutions. The Bronze Age collapse destroyed the Greek superstructure completely, but the substrate survived, attenuated and transformed but recognizable. And from that surviving substrate, a new superstructure could eventually be built. The recovery wasn't a restoration of what had been lost. It was a new creation, built on old foundations, shaped by the unique conditions of the post-collapse world. Our own civilization has both superstructure and substrate. Our governments, our economies, our technologies, these are our superstructure. Our languages, our values, our stories, our sense of shared identity, these are our substrate. If our superstructure were damaged or destroyed, how resilient would our substrate be? Would our cultural foundations survive long enough for new institutions to be built on them? Or would the substrate itself be damaged by the collapse of the superstructure? These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions the Dark Ages force us to confront. The Greeks survived because their cultural substrate was resilient enough to outlast 4 centuries of institutional collapse. Whether our own cultural substrate would prove equally resilient is an open question that depends on factors we can only partially control. Now let me tell you about something that happened during the transition from Dark Ages to Archaic period that perfectly illustrates the creative energy unleashed by the recovery. Because the Greeks didn't just rebuild what had been lost. They invented things that had never existed before. And one of the most remarkable of these inventions was something so fundamental to modern life that we barely notice it even though it surrounds us constantly. I am talking about coinage, the invention of money in the form of standardized metal coins. Now, money in the broader sense, the concept of using some medium to facilitate exchange, is ancient. Bronze Age civilizations used various commodities as units of account and exchange. Silver was weighed out for transactions. Grain served as a form of currency. But standardized coins, pieces of metal stamped with an official mark guaranteeing their weight and purity, that was something new. And it appeared in the Greek world, specifically in Lydia, in Western Anatolia, and in Greek Ionia, around the 7th century BCE. The invention of coinage might seem like a small thing compared to philosophy or democracy, but its effects were revolutionary. Coins made trade faster and more efficient. You didn't need to weigh metal for every transaction. We didn't need to assess purity. The stamp on the coin guaranteed its value. This reduced transaction costs dramatically and facilitated an explosion of commercial activity. Coinage also had profound social and political implications. It made wealth more portable and more concealable. A landowner's wealth was visible, tied to a specific place. A merchant's coined wealth could be hidden, moved, invested flexibly. This shifted power away from the old landed aristocracy toward a new class of commercial entrepreneurs. It created social mobility, the possibility of becoming wealthy through trade rather than being born wealthy through land inheritance. Many scholars believe that the social disruptions caused by the spread of coinage contributed to the political upheavals of the archaic period, the rise of tyrants, the reform movements, and eventually the development of democracy. When wealth could be earned rather than just inherited, when new men could become powerful through commerce, the old aristocratic monopoly on power became unsustainable. New political forms were needed to accommodate the new social reality. And none of this would have happened without the preceding collapse. The Mycenaean palace economies had no need for coinage because the palace managed economic distribution directly. Coins are useful in a market economy where independent actors conduct transactions without central coordination. The market economy that produced coinage could only have developed in the absence of centralized palace control. The Dark Ages destroyed the palaces. The absence of palaces created space for markets. Markets created the need for money. Money transformed social structure. Transformed social structure demanded new political forms. New political forms included democracy. The chain of causation runs directly from catastrophic collapse to democratic innovation, not inevitably, not automatically, but recognizably. The Dark Ages didn't just destroy, they created. They cleared ground on which entirely new structures could be built, structures that the old order would never have permitted. And here is one more detail about the recovery that I find deeply moving, and that I want to share with you before we move into the final section of this exploration. It concerns the moment when the Greeks first became aware that their past was deeper and stranger than their myths had led them to believe. In the 5th century BCE, the Greek historian Thucydides wrote a passage in the introduction to his History of the Peloponnesian War, where he tried to reconstruct the early history of Greece. He had no written sources for this period. He had only the myths and legends and oral traditions that had come down to him. But he approached this material with a critical mind, trying to separate probable fact from obvious fiction. Thucydides concluded that early Greece had been a backward place, sparsely populated and politically fragmented. He imagined that the Greeks had originally lived in small scattered communities without walls or permanent institutions, moving frequently and never developing any significant wealth or power. He thought the Trojan War had been a real event, but much smaller and less glorious than Homer depicted. He believed that Greek civilization was relatively young, that the advances of his own time, the navies, the wealth, the political sophistication, were recent developments without deep historical roots. He was wrong about almost everything. He had no idea that Mycenaean Greece had been wealthy, powerful, literate, and internationally connected over 700 years before his own time. He didn't know about the palaces, the bureaucracies, the trade networks, the writing system. He thought the Greeks had always been relatively primitive until recent centuries. The Dark Ages had so completely erased memory of the Bronze Age that even the most brilliant historian of antiquity couldn't see past the gap. When I read Thucydides trying his best to reconstruct a past that was hidden from him by centuries of silence, I feel a profound sympathy across the millennia. Here was one of the greatest minds of the ancient world, doing his honest best with the evidence available to him, and getting it fundamentally wrong because the evidence he needed had been destroyed centuries before he was born. His error wasn't a failure of intelligence or method, it was a failure of information. The data had been lost, and no amount of brilliance could compensate for its absence. And this makes me wonder what errors we are making right now. What gaps in our knowledge are leading us to fundamentally wrong conclusions about the past, or the present, or the future? We have incomparably more information than Thucydides had, but we also have incomparably more complexity to understand. Are there Bronze Age collapses in our own knowledge? Periods or topics or dimensions of reality where critical information has been lost or was never recorded, leaving us to construct narratives that feel convincing but are fundamentally wrong? Almost certainly yes. The history of knowledge is a history of confident errors being overturned by new evidence. Things every educated person knew to be true turned out to be false. Things dismissed as impossible turned out to be real. The map of human knowledge is full of blank spaces and mislabeled regions and confident markings that point in the wrong direction. We are all Thucydides, doing our best with incomplete information, getting some things right and some things wrong, in proportions we cannot yet determine. That humility, that awareness of the limits of our own knowledge, might be the most valuable thing we can take from the story of the Dark Ages. Not just the specific historical lessons about collapse and resilience and the fragility of writing, though those are important, but the deeper epistemic lesson that our understanding of reality is always partial, always provisional, always subject to revision by evidence we haven't yet encountered. The Greeks who emerged from the Dark Ages didn't know what they didn't know. They built their civilizational myths they believed were history. They created magnificent achievements on foundations of ignorance. And in the end, those achievements were magnificent regardless, because human creativity doesn't require perfect knowledge of the past. It requires imagination, courage, determination, and the willingness to build something new even when, especially when, you don't fully understand what came before. We are building on foundations of ignorance too. We always have been. The question is whether we can be honest about that, whether we can maintain the humility to keep learning, keep questioning, keep revising our understanding as new evidence emerges. The Dark Ages ended when people started reconnecting, started trading, started sharing ideas and stories and technologies across the boundaries that had separated them. The darkness was dispelled not by any single brilliant insight, but by the slow, patient accumulation of connection and exchange. That process continues. It continues every time someone learns something new and shares it with someone else. It continues every time a researcher uncovers evidence that changes our understanding. It continues every time a teacher helps a student see the world differently. It continues right now in this video as I share with you a story that was forgotten for millennia and that you will carry forward into conversations and thoughts and understandings that I cannot predict. That is what makes this story ultimately hopeful despite all its darkness. The thread held, the chain of transmission survived, the silence was broken, and the voices that emerged from the silence have been speaking ever since, growing louder with each generation, carrying knowledge further with each generation, before see more technology of communication, from oral poetry to alphabetic writing, to printed books to digital media. The thread is stronger now than it has ever been. But it is not unbreakable. It never was. And remembering that is perhaps the most important thing we can do. Everything I have told you so far has been building to something, and I need you to understand what that something is, because it is bigger than the Bronze Age, and bigger than the Dark Ages, and bigger than any single civilization that has ever risen or fallen on this planet. It is about a pattern so consistent across human history that once you see it, you will never be able to unsee it, and it will change how you interpret every news headline, every political debate, every technological announcement, every conversation about the future of our species. The pattern is this: civilizations do not die the way people think they die. We imagine collapse as a dramatic event, an invasion, an earthquake, a single catastrophic moment when the old world ends and the new world begins. We imagine it because that is how stories work. Stories have climaxes. Stories have turning points. Stories have clear before and after moments. But civilizations are not stories. They are systems. And systems don't collapse in dramatic moments. They degrade through accumulating failures that individually seem manageable but collectively become overwhelming. Nobody in the Mycenaean world woke up one morning and said, "Today is the day civilization ends." What they probably said was the harvest was bad again this year. What they probably said was the tin shipment is late again. What they probably said was another village was raided last month. What they probably said was the palace is demanding more tribute, but providing less in return. Each of these statements describes a small problem, a manageable difficulty, the kind of thing civilizations deal with all the time. But when all of these small problems happen simultaneously, and when each one makes the others worse, you get a cascading failure that no individual response can address, because the problem isn't any single failure. The problem is the interaction between failures. And this is the part that terrifies me, because when I look at the modern world, I don't see a single catastrophic threat that is going to bring everything crashing down tomorrow. What I see is a constellation of manageable problems that are increasingly interacting with each other in ways that make each one harder to solve. Climate change makes agriculture less predictable. Less predictable agriculture drives migration. Migration creates political tensions. Political tensions make international cooperation harder. Harder cooperation makes addressing climate change more difficult. And the cycle feeds on itself. Each problem amplifying the others, each solution creating new complications. This is exactly the pattern that preceded the Bronze Age collapse. Not one big problem. Many interacting problems. Not a sudden catastrophe. A slow accumulation of stresses that eventually overwhelmed the system's capacity to cope. The people living through it probably didn't realize what was happening because each individual problem seemed solvable. It was only in retrospect, thousands of years later, that scholars could see the pattern and understand that the whole system had been sliding toward a tipping point beyond which recovery was impossible. Are we sliding toward a tipping point? I genuinely do not know. Nobody knows. That is the honest truth. Complex systems are inherently unpredictable. They can absorb enormous stress and appear stable right up until the moment they catastrophically fail. The Bronze Age system looked stable in 1250 BCE. By 1150 BCE, it was gone. A century. That is all it took. 1 century from apparent stability to total collapse. But here is the thing, and this is absolutely critical. The fact that we can see the pattern, the fact that we can study the Bronze Age collapse and understand its mechanisms, the fact that we can draw parallels and identify vulnerabilities, this gives us something the Mycenaeans never had. It gives us foresight. Not perfect foresight. Not the ability to predict exactly what will happen, but the ability to recognize warning signs, to identify vulnerabilities, to take preventive action before small problems become cascading failures. The Mycenaean king, watching his grain stores dwindle, didn't have access to paleoclimatic data showing a multi-decade drought trend. He didn't have economic models showing how trait disruption in one region could cascade through the entire system. He didn't have historical case studies of previous civilizational collapses to learn from. He was flying blind, responding to immediate crises without understanding the deeper patterns that were driving them. We are not flying blind. We have data. We have models. We have history. We have the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of human experience, including the experience of catastrophic failure. If we choose to use that knowledge, if we choose to learn from the Dark Ages rather than simply being fascinated by them, we have a genuine chance of avoiding the same fate. But choosing to learn requires first choosing to pay attention. It requires looking past the comfortable assumption that everything will be fine because it has always been fine before. It requires confronting the uncomfortable reality that sophisticated civilizations can and do fail. It requires taking seriously the possibility that our own civilization, for all its achievements and all its power, is not immune to the same forces that have brought down every previous civilization in human history. And it requires humility. The deep bone-level humility that comes from understanding that we are not special. We are not the culmination of history. We are not the final destination of human progress. We are one civilization among many, one moment in a long story, and the story will continue after us whether we like it or not. The question is whether we write the next chapter, or whether the next chapter is another dark age, another period of silence, another gap in the record where future historians will find nothing but ruins and questions. Now I want to tell you about one final discovery that puts everything I've discussed into devastating perspective. Because there is one detail about the late Bronze Age collapse that I've been saving, one piece of evidence so chilling in its implications that when I first encountered it, I had to put down the book I was reading and just sit with it for a while. At the site of ancient Ugarit on the coast of modern Syria, archaeologists found a collection of clay tablets in the destruction layer marking the city's final days. Ugarit was one of the great cosmopolitan trading cities of the late Bronze Age. The city I mentioned earlier, where texts in 8 languages and 5 scripts were found. It was wealthy, sophisticated, internationally connected, a jewel of Bronze Age civilization, and it was completely and permanently destroyed around 1185 BCE. Among the tablets found in the destruction layer are letters, not administrative records, not economic inventories, letters, personal communications between real people facing real crises, and they are absolutely heartbreaking to read. One letter is from the King of Ugarit to the King of Cyprus, the large island that was one of Ugarit's most important trading partners. The letter describes enemy ships attacking the coast. The King of Ugarit is desperate. He writes that his army is stationed in Hittite territory far to the north. His fleet is deployed elsewhere. The city is essentially defenseless. He begs for help. Another letter found at the site appears to be a response from someone in Cyprus. The tone is sympathetic but helpless. The writer says that his own region is also under attack. He cannot send help. He advises the King of Ugarit to stand firm, to defend his city with whatever forces he has available. It is the ancient equivalent of thoughts and prayers from someone who has nothing else to offer. There is another letter from a high official of the Hittite Empire to the King of Ugarit. The official acknowledges that enemy forces have been sighted. He requests that the King of Ugarit send any information about the enemy's movements. He promises that reinforcements are being organized. But the promise has the hollow ring of bureaucratic procedure being followed, even when everyone knows the bureaucracy can no longer deliver. And then there is one more letter, and this is the one that stops me in my tracks every time I think about it. It is a letter that was found in a kiln, not in the archive with the other tablets. In a kiln. It had been written but never sent. The clay was being fired to harden it for its journey to the recipient, but the city was destroyed before the letter could be dispatched. The letter is from the King of Ugarit to the King of Cyprus. In it, the King of Ugarit describes the situation in terms of barely controlled panic. Enemy ships have been sighted. The city is in grave danger. He pleads for immediate military assistance. He describes his own forces as insufficient to meet the threat. And then he writes a line that has echoed across 3,000 years of silence. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. That letter was never sent. The clay was still in the kiln when the city burned. The King of Ugarit was writing to his ally for help that would never come, preparing to send a message that would never arrive, placing his hope in a system of international cooperation that had already ceased to function. He was following the procedures of a world that no longer existed, reaching out through diplomatic channels that had already collapsed, trusting in relationships that could no longer deliver. And then Ugarit burned. And it was never rebuilt. The site was abandoned so completely that its very name was forgotten. For 3,000 years Ugarit lay under the earth, its libraries of multilingual texts buried, its last desperate letters unread, its final king unnamed and unknown. It wasn't rediscovered until 1928 when a farmer's plough struck the top of a buried tomb and archaeologists began excavating what turned out to be one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. That unsent letter from the King of Ugarit is for me the single most powerful artifact from the entire Bronze Age collapse. More powerful than the gold mask of Agamemnon, more powerful than the ruins of Troy, more powerful than any Linear B tablet, because it captures in a few lines of desperate prose the moment when a real human being realized that the world he depended on had failed him, the system he trusted, the alliances he relied on, the institutions that were supposed to protect him and his people, all of it had broken down, and he was alone, writing a letter that would never be read, asking for help that would never come, placing his faith in a network that had already dissolved. Every time I read that letter, I think about the systems I depend on. The emergency services I assume will respond if I call. The supply chains I assume will keep the grocery stores stocked. The financial institutions I assume will honor my money. The international agreements I assume will maintain peace. The infrastructure I assume will keep the electricity flowing and the water running and the internet functioning. All of these are systems, networks of cooperation and mutual obligation maintained by institutions and relationships. And like the diplomatic network that failed the king of Ugarit, they function until they don't. I'm not saying they will fail. I am saying that the assumption they cannot fail is precisely the assumption that makes failure more likely. Because when you assume a system is invulnerable, you stop maintaining it. You stop investing in resilience. You stop building redundancy. You stop preparing contingencies. And then when the stress comes, when the drought hits, or the trade route breaks, or the earthquake shakes, or the enemy ships appear on the horizon, you find yourself writing letters that will never be sent to allies who can no longer help you. The King of Ugarit's unsent letter is a warning from across 30 centuries of silence. It says, do not assume the system will hold. It says, do not take your alliances for granted. It says, do not trust that tomorrow will look like today. It says, prepare. It says, pay attention. It says, the darkness can fall faster than you imagine. But it also says something else, something that I think is equally important. It says that even in the face of catastrophe, even at the very end, people try. The King of Ugarit didn't give up. He wrote his letter, he made his plea, he did what he could with what he had, even when what he had was clearly insufficient. That is not defeat. That is not surrender. That is the fundamental human refusal to go quietly, the stubborn insistence on acting even when action seems futile. And in the long run that stubbornness won, not for the King of Ugarit personally. He probably died when his city burned, but for humanity as a whole, the refusal to give up, the determination to keep trying, the insistence on maintaining the thread of civilization, even when it seemed about to snap, that is what eventually brought the Dark Ages to an end. Not any single heroic act, but millions of ordinary people doing what the King of Ugarit did, trying to grow enough food, trying to maintain their communities, trying to remember their stories, trying to worship their gods, trying to trade with their neighbors, trying to build something, anything, in the ruins of a world that had fallen apart. And they succeeded. It took 400 years, but they succeeded. The darkness ended. Writing returned. Cities grew. Trade resumed. Culture flourished. Philosophy was born. Democracy was invented. Theatre was created. History was written for the first time. And none of it would have happened without those generations of nameless people who refused to give up, who kept the thread alive through the darkest period in Mediterranean history. We are the heirs of their stubbornness. Every word in every language written in every alphabet derived from the Phoenician Greek tradition carries within it the memory of a world that was lost and a world that was rebuilt. Every sentence is evidence that the silence didn't last forever. Every paragraph is proof that human beings can survive the worst and emerge stronger. That is the real story of the 3,000 years humanity never wrote about. Not just a story of collapse and darkness and forgetting. A story of resilience and recovery and reinvention. A story about the worst thing that can happen and the best thing that can emerge from it. A story about the fragility of everything we build and the indestructibility of the human drive to build it again. And now I want to tell you something directly, not as a narrator recounting ancient events, but as one human being speaking to another across whatever distance separates us. You are part of this story, not metaphorically, literally. The civilization you live in, the language you speak, the writing system you use, the political ideals you hold, the philosophical traditions you participate in, whether you know it or not. All of these trace back through an unbroken chain of transmission to the moment when the Dark Ages ended and Greek civilization was reborn. You are the living proof that the collapse was survived. Your existence is the evidence that the thread held. And every time you read a book or write a message or engage in rational argument or participate in democratic governance or simply think critically about the world around you, you are continuing a tradition that very nearly died 3,000 years ago, and that was saved by generations of stubborn, resilient people who refused to let the darkness win. That is why this story matters, not as an abstract historical curiosity, not as a cautionary tale about ancient mistakes, but as a reminder of what you are part of and what you carry forward every single day. The thread of civilization passes through your hands right now. What you do with it, whether you strengthen it or let it fray, whether you maintain it or take it for granted, that matters. It matters not in some grand cosmic sense, but in the very practical sense that everything we value about our world depends on continuous active maintenance by people who understand its importance and are willing to do the work. The king of Ugarit's unsent letter sat in a kiln for 3,000 years before anyone read it. When archaeologists finally pulled it from the earth and scholars finally deciphered its desperate plea, they gave voice to a man who had been silenced for 30 centuries. They completed the communication he had tried and failed to make. They connected his world to ours across an almost unimaginable gulf of time. That connection is what history is, not dates and names and battles. Connection. The recognition that the people who came before us were people, as real and as complex and as afraid and as hopeful as we are. The understanding that their experiences have something to teach us if we are willing to listen. The awareness that we are linked to them not just genetically but culturally through chains of transmission that stretch back thousands of years and that depend on us for their continuation. If you have watched this entire video, then you have done something remarkable. You have sat with one of the most important and least known stories in human history, and you have given it your attention. In a world of infinite distractions and endless competing demands for your time, you chose to spend this time learning about the past. And that choice matters more than you probably realize, because attention is the most valuable resource in the modern world, and what you pay attention to shapes what you understand, and what you understand shapes what you do. You now know something that most people don't. You know that writing can be lost. You know that civilizations can collapse. You know that progress is not inevitable. You know that the world you live in is the product of catastrophe and recovery, of loss and reinvention, of darkness and the stubborn human refusal to accept it. You know about the king of Ugarit and his unsent letter. You know about the scribe at Pylos and his final tablet. You know about the 400 years of silence and the alphabet that broke it. What you do with that knowledge is entirely up to you. But I hope you will carry it forward. I hope you will share it, discuss it, think about it, let it inform how you see the world. I hope you will be a little more aware of the fragility of the systems you depend on and a little more committed to maintaining them. I hope you will be a little more humble about what we know and a little more curious about what we don't. And I hope you will remember that thread of civilization has survived worse than anything we currently face, and that it survived because ordinary people refused to let it break. If this video has earned your subscription, then I welcome you to this community of people who believe that understanding the past is essential to navigating the future. If it has earned your like, then that engagement helps other people find this story, and every person who hears it becomes another node in the network of awareness, another link in the chain of transmission. And if it has earned your comment, then I want to hear from you, because the best conversations I have ever had about history happen not in lecture halls or academic conferences, but right here in the comments section, where people from every background and every perspective come together to think about what the past means for the present. The 3,000 years humanity never wrote about are no longer silent. The words have been found. The tablets have been read. The letters have been read. The letters have been delivered. 3,000 years late, but delivered nonetheless. The story has been told, and now it lives in you. The darkness fell once. It could fall again, but it doesn't have to. Not if we remember. Not if we learn. Not if we maintain the thread with the same stubborn determination that carried it through 4 centuries of silence and brought it back into the light. The silence is broken. Let's make sure it stays that way.